Now, the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis inspired protests nationwide against police brutality and racism. That includes one on Friday in our nation's capital. Brandi Kellam spoke with local leaders to find out how they changed community outreach in the aftermath of Floyd's death.
The image of George Floyd gasping for his last breath created outrage that spread like wildfire from Minneapolis to the rest of the world. And while media attention focused more on the massive protests in the streets, local leaders point to another significant camaraderie they say is a first for the city.
I definitely think this dark, tragic moment has brought us closer together and has made us realize that we have to work together and that there's a lot of work to be done.
Like many other cities across the United States, George Floyd's death seemed like the tipping point that unified people around social justice like never before.
We came out here to sit in the pain and to lament.
In Minneapolis, faith leaders have been showing up in greater number than they have in recent years, marching with Black Lives Matter activists calling for reform.
The church has really left the building. It is a church beyond the walls, and we are experiencing how to navigate through that just as much as anybody else is.
Some Black leaders say George Floyd's death fostered an awakening for the faith community to have more candid conversation around racism and police brutality.
We always preach about Moses and the Egyptians. We always speak about how they came out of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea and stayed in the wilderness and then moved into the Promised Land. That's our story. I mean, that's Black. That's our civil rights right there. But that subject is getting old. Because what do you do when you get to the Promised Land and there's racism there?
White supremacy, which is the source of systemic racism, oppression, bearing down on us, trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, and we can't breathe.
Leaders say that awakening created an overdue opportunity for multiple generations to put aside differences on what role faith plays in advocating for justice.
The sound that is spiritual above every sound is the sound of justice. The sound that's above every sound is the sound of freedom. It's the remix, and it's coming over and over again because of those that went before.
Regardless of whether they find the perfect mixture of traditional methods with new ideas, leaders say they'd rather prioritize the needs of the community.
One of the things we saw after Jamar Clark was murdered was a number of Black leaderships rise up, both in city council and attorney general position and the chief of police position. I expect to see that more.
Relationship with the police and the public has to be different. If they're going to exist in the community as any type of force, it can't be a force against us. It has to be a force for us.
I think the laws are too monopolized on civil rights only. George Floyd, civil rights were violated, but no one's talking about his human rights, the right to breathe.
And while George Floyd's death has inspired a historic effort to create unity, Minneapolis leaders seem less focused on establishing one approach, but instead appreciating their individual strengths. Brandi Kellam, CBS News.